What would be required for Boeing to rise from the ashes? Well, one thing that is fairly obvious is an all-new aircraft, but can Boeing pull that off alone, or will they need some help? Stay tuned. I have looked at Boeing's many problems over the past few months, but recently I've instead also started covering some more positive news, specifically around the arrival of their new CEO, Kelly Ortberg. In his previous role, he was the CEO of Rockwell Collins, a manufacturer of avionics and other key aircraft systems, and that company then merged to form part of RTX, and that process was overseen by Ortberg. Now, you can go and watch the full video that I made about him if you want to, but I'm now going to go through and quickly summarize the key challenges that faces him as Boeing's new CEO. Basically, to turn Boeing's fortunes around, Ortberg will need to become an extraordinary storyteller. That means that he needs to be someone that can convince all of Wall Street, his board members, investors, suppliers, airlines, mid-level engineers, and also, of course, those that are working on the factory floor about what needs to be done. He will need to rally everyone up and down the company and even beyond the company, but in order to convince them, he also needs a good story to tell. And if you are an aircraft manufacturer, obviously the best story that you can tell is one about a new aircraft. And that is what this video is about. And in my view, possible way to get Boeing back on its track in a process that might seem tricky, but at the same time, a way that Boeing has actually considered seriously before, and not that long ago either. But before we go into that plan, there are a lot of things that Ortberg first needs to sort out in his new company, and most of these things really can't wait. He needs to, for example, stabilize the production of both the 737 and the 787, and also increase the production rate to something closer to what the company has promised to its customers, whilst obviously also maintaining that in a safe way. Then there is the certification of the Boeing 777X, which was going really nicely until last August, but is now facing new issues that could delay it further. And don't forget the certification of the 737 MAX 7 and MAX 10, which are also hanging in limbo right now, awaiting the approval of fixes to their nacelles and engine anti-icing systems. Meanwhile, Boeing also needs to finish the reabsorption of Spirit AeroSystems, which is a company that currently makes a lot of Boeing's aircraft structures, including the entire fuselage of the 737. And on top of this, there are also many military and space programs that needs attention, including the very public and embarrassing situation around the Boeing Starliner. But the most pressing matter for Kelly Ortberg right now is Boeing's relationship with its employees, specifically with its machinists and their union in Washington state. By the time that you watch this video, the discussions will have evolved enough to offer us some clues about how well or how badly Boeing's immediate future looks like, because a workers' strike is literally the last thing that Boeing needs right now. And crucially, a key point in these negotiations is where Boeing will build the next all-new aircraft. Obviously, the machinist wants to build that plane in Washington state, which could also make a lot of sense for Boeing since there's plenty of space in Everett where the 747 and the 787 used to be made. So, will Boeing make its next airliner in that region, either in Everett or even perhaps in Renton, where the 757 used to be made and the 737 still is? Well, in the first draft of the proposal that Boeing sent to the unions, they indicated that they would commit to this, but only if the new plane is launched during the duration of the contract. In other words, during the next 4 years. The problem is that it might be difficult for Boeing to commit beyond that if they don't even know when they will make their next aircraft and what kind of aircraft that will be. But this is where things start to get interesting. You see, we know that up until 2019, when the 737 MAX was grounded, Boeing were trying to decide if and when to launch their new mid-size airplane, or the NMA. That aircraft would primarily be intended to replace the 757, but its size would have to make it competitive with the Airbus A321neo, as well as its longer range variant, the A321XLR. But that wasn't all that Boeing was working on back then. You see, when Airbus basically absorbed the Bombardier C series back in 2018 and turned it into the Airbus A220, Boeing also started discussions with Embraer in order to purchase a controlling stake in its commercial aircraft side of the business. In essence, as Scott Hamilton pointed out in Liam News at the time, Boeing needed to find engineering talent in order to design its new NMA. And Embraer's engineers had then just finished work on both the E-2 jet family and the military C-390 cargo plane. So the way that both companies saw it, Boeing had the funds and the market clout as a big player, while Embraer had the engineering talent. A perfect match, in other words. But that deal ended up going nowhere. The joint venture was officially announced in February of 2019, shortly before the 737 MAX groundings, but then this and other delays held everything up until 2020, when the pandemic finally caused Boeing to just dump the deal. Now this made Embraer, understandably, absolutely furious, and they sued Boeing, who in turn claimed that Embraer didn't satisfy the necessary conditions for the joint venture, rather than admitting that the Boeing MAX issues had anything to do with their decision, which was kind of par for course in how they were behaving in general back then. Needless to say, this caused the two companies to fall out badly. And to make things even worse, Embraer was at the time in serious financial difficulties, and many analysts believed that its survival without Boeing, especially in the middle of a pandemic, looked very uncertain. Now thankfully Embraer survived, partially thanks to their business jet arm, whose demand just skyrocketed during the pandemic and bolstered their financials slightly. But what did Boeing do then after this cancelled deal? Well, in January of 2020, before the pandemic, but with the 737 MAX still grounded, Boeing basically went into full survival mode. Their board fired the previous CEO, Dennis Muilenburg, and then the newly appointed CEO, Dave Calhoun, cancelled the new mid-size airplane completely, basically starting the end chapter of the dark cycle that we're now seeing. But this all happened back in 2020. What's interesting for this story is how things are looking right now. And with the passage of time, this has just meant that replacing the Boeing 737 is just becoming more and more important. And that also goes for finding a replacement for the Boeing 757. So in reality, they now need to come up with a strategy that can replace both of these types. Now that will likely include a family of aircraft with several different models, which at the smaller end will need to be able to compete with the Airbus A220, while at the upper end ideally would be even bigger than the 757. And that's because Boeing never really offered a 787 small enough to fully replace the Boeing 767. Now, creating a new plane able to fully replace the 737, the 757 and a bit of the 767 sounds like quite a tall order. But that's unless Boeing decides to actually design two aircraft instead of one. But how would that even be possible? I mean, Kelly Ortberg might be a great CEO, but can Boeing really go ahead and develop two aircraft side by side like they did with the 757 and the 767 back in the late 1970s? Well, I can think of one strategy that could make this possible, but that would involve a new partnership with their current frenemy, Embraer. But before we get into that, how would you like me to explain exactly how we operate the Boeing 737 from inside of the cockpit? Me and one of my absolute best friends, fellow typewriting examiner Ben, have created a super detailed course where we explain what, how and why pilots do what we do.
Now, flaps 30 and we are above 1,000 feet, so we're nice and stabilized before 1,000 feet.
In it, we will explain everything from how to set up the cockpit to how to properly handle the aircraft to all of the different flight phases, and we will also show you how to fly one of the trickiest approaches in the world. Everything with the help of videos, a dedicated e-learning platform, checklists, charts and much more. This is perfect for anyone wanting to get some real value out of their home simulator or anyone who's just curious to learn more about how we fly the beautiful 737. And you won't find anything as detailed yet easy to understand anywhere else, I promise you that. So to get your hands on over 10 hours of instruction as well as loads of extra material, head over to virtual737course.com and use the discount code Mentour now for an exclusive 20% discount. This will really transform the way that you understand what and why we do what we do, so you should really check it out. Now, where was I? Yeah. As I already explained, Boeing basically destroyed their relationship with Embraer back in 2020. So how could Kelly Ortberg, or really anyone at Boeing, somehow fix this? And what would be the point of it, especially for Embraer? Well, let's start with that part of it. The reason Embraer agreed to a joint venture with Boeing in the first place was because they didn't really have the money to design an all-new aircraft by themselves. As I already said, Boeing could at the time find such funding much more easily, being the giant that they were, and they were also in a position where they had a much bigger potential customer order book. Now here we also need to talk a little bit about the Embraer E2 aircraft family, which should have consisted of the E175-E2, the E190-E2 and the E195-E2. Of these, the smaller E175-E2 was supposed to be a replacement for the first generation of E175, an extremely popular regional aircraft in the United States. But the reason that I said that the E2 family should have consisted of these three models is because the E175-E2 turned out to be a non-starter. You see, in order to operate as a regional aircraft in the United States, the smallest E2 needed to have a maximum takeoff weight of 86,000 pounds or 39 tons according to the scope clause agreements that the regionals have with their pilot unions. But the newer E2 variant came with new engines, which were more efficient but also heavier, putting the weight of the aircraft just outside of these scope clause rules. Now Embraer was obviously well aware of this, but previous weight increases and possibly some bad feedback from its airline customers convinced Embraer that the maximum takeoff weight allowed would eventually be pushed even higher, making the E175-E2 ideal for this role. But that never happened. This was obviously a huge loss for Embraer, who had now developed this E2 variant basically for nothing, and it also impacted Pratt & Whitney, who had developed a super compact version of its geared turbofan engine just for the E175-E2. So what this all means is that right now, this plane and its bespoke engine is basically frozen indefinitely until either a new market opens up or the scope clauses are changed to allow it. Now in my mind that's absolutely idiotic, since this new aircraft is both more economic, more modern and better for the environment, but anyway. This obviously hit Embraer's bottom line, although they are still selling the E175, keeping their hands inside of the lucrative cookie jar that is the American regional market. And here it is also worth pointing out just how new this original E-series still was when Embraer launched the updated E2 version. The first E-Jet had entered service as late as in 2004, whereas the first E2 started carrying passengers in 2018, only 14 years later, which is a really tight timeline as aircraft models go. The reason that Embraer launched this updated model was because of competition from Bombardier and their C-Series, which today we know as the Airbus A220. Embraer basically had no choice. The alternative would have been to abandon the E-Series completely in favor of an all-new design, which would have cost them way more money to do. And here, when we're talking about cost, is where things start to get interesting, because this was also what brought Boeing into the picture. According to the Air Current, Embraer's entire E2 program cost just $1.7 billion to develop, and Embraer developed it on time and on budget, even a bit more efficient than they had originally anticipated. Now, that wouldn't have been that impressive if the E2 was simply a re-engined E-Series, but it really isn't. You see, the length of each models are different from previous versions, the wings are updated, and each E2 variant also has a different wing version, which is really unusual, because normally different versions are just stretched copies using the same wings. On top of that, the E2 also has fly-by-wire for its primary flight controls, which the original version did not have. And changing the controls was done to save weight and to make it possible to reduce the size of the tail surfaces, which reduced drag and improved efficiency overall. And Embraer managed to pull that off while also maintaining the same pilot type ratings as the original E-Series. Their ability to engineer the E2 at this speed and cost discipline got Boeing's attention, especially since Embraer at the time were also developing a military freighter, the C390. And this is what convinced Boeing that, with the right strategy and funding, Embraer would be the perfect partner to help design and develop their new mid-size airplane. But today, the realities have obviously changed for both Boeing and Embraer. But both of them still have almost exactly the same problems to solve. Boeing still needs to develop something to get them out of this stalemate that they're in and give them a leg up on Airbus. And as it turns out, Embraer also want to develop something new. For a while now, they have been looking for a partner to help create their next aircraft. A design that initially looked like it was going to be a turboprop with a low wing design and the engines placed either on the wing or in the rear of the fuselage. This aircraft idea never got a proper name other than the Embraer next generation turboprop, but it would have used the fuselage and many systems of the E-series in order to save on development costs. Embraer first announced this project back in 2019, while their joint venture with Boeing was still on, and that would have definitely made sense, since such an aircraft would have complemented the fleets of both companies. But ultimately, Embraer quietly abandoned this project, partly because they couldn't find a partner to replace Boeing, but also because development plans for new, more efficient turboprop engines by General Electric and Pratt & Whitney appear to be on hold. So lately, Embraer have seemed more interested in developing an aircraft closer in size to the Airbus A320 or the Boeing 737. But John Ostrauer in the Air Current explains that such an aircraft would cost Embraer around $10 to $15 billion to develop, as opposed to the $1.7 billion of the E2. Embraer just isn't big enough to do that alone. Its market capitalization is only a fraction of that projected development cost, around $5.5 billion, and the Brazilian company doesn't want to make the same mistake that Bombardier made with the C-Series, developing something that they really can't afford and therefore risk having it either, given away or forcing them into bankruptcy. So for the past few years, Embraer have instead been looking for someone with deeper pockets to share the cost of developing this new aircraft either as a turboprop or a bigger single-aisle jet. They have reportedly been talking to basically everyone, including aerospace companies like Saab, engine manufacturers, and multiple national entities or investors in Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, South Korea, and most recently Japan. But unfortunately, it looks like finding a new partner to do this with will be quite difficult. For example, Japanese funding could be dependent on the new aircraft running on alternative fuels like hydrogen, something that is part of Embraer's future plans, but not quite yet. So in May this year, the company stated that they no longer have plans for a new narrow-body jet, but they are still looking for partners, both industrial and financial, to help them expand their business and product offerings. So maybe you can see where I'm going with this. Could Boeing swoop in here again and start working together with Embraer despite what happened last time when Boeing effectively left Embraer at the altar? And by the way, it's worth noting that for months before the original Boeing-Embraer joint venture was supposed to go ahead, Embraer had effectively stopped promoting new sales of the whole E2 aircraft series, expecting sale prospects to be much better together with Boeing. So, what's changed now? Well, obviously, I will have to massively speculate now, which can be quite fun. But what you need to remember is that if Boeing are to start mending their ways, they already have a long list of people to impress, which includes the airlines, the FAA, the NTSB, their suppliers, and of course their own employees. If Boeing actually changed and convincingly fixed their safety culture, their quality and production problems, and if they genuinely leave behind the toxicity that has plagued their management for the last couple of decades, well, maybe that would be enough to impress Embraer and bring them back to the table. But even so, if a new deal would go ahead, Embraer likely wouldn't want it to have the same form as it did before, where Embraer's commercial division would have been getting in under complete Boeing control. Now, it wouldn't have been an outright sale, but the division would have been called Boeing Brazil Commercial, dropping the Embraer name, something that a lot of people in Brazil really didn't like. So this time around, Boeing likely wouldn't insist on such a partnership, since Boeing has its own machinists and other workers to think about as well. Remember, Boeing's machinists union wants the next aircraft to be built around Seattle, and definitely not in Brazil. So to make this new venture work, Boeing could, for example, with some help of Embraer's engineers, design an updated new mid-market airplane family in the range of sizes between 190 to 260 passengers. And this new family of jets would then effectively replace the larger 737 models, the 757 and the 767, and be built in Washington state. Embraer could then design a smaller aircraft that would slot below Boeing's NMA in size, matching the smaller 737s and down to the Airbus A220. But in this case, since both of these airplane families would be made from scratch, they could share key technologies, supply networks, and even training infrastructure for pilots and airline ground crews. The exact size of each aircraft and where they would meet might have to be adjusted a bit, not just because of market considerations, but also so that Boeing can keep its unions happy. But right now, one of Boeing's main problems is that it doesn't have a complete aircraft lineup like Airbus does. But with an Embraer partnership, Boeing could turn that problem onto its head, since unlike Airbus, whose A220 family doesn't share a part networks or even a pilot type rating with the bigger A320 family, Boeing and Embraer could optimize their planes to do just that. So with this idea, Boeing wouldn't need to create two new aircraft by itself. Instead, it would be done as a partnership, while still maintaining all of the upsides of doing it in-house. And together with the 787 and the Boeing 777X, this could complete the next generation of Boeing's aircraft from the smallest all the way up to the biggest. For Embraer, a partnership with Boeing could have another benefit as well. The military C-390 cargo plane has been slow at securing international sales, although things have been looking up slightly lately. And Embraer are allegedly now looking for ways to market this aircraft to the United States. So wouldn't it be nice if Embraer could partner with an American company? Perhaps a big company that is already a military contractor to get this done? Actually, Boeing and Embraer were previously in talks for two joint ventures, one for Embraer's commercial aircraft, and the other was specifically about the promotion of the C-390 internationally, so this could definitely make a lot of sense. Of course, all of this, and particularly the commercial aircraft projects, will require funding, which likely won't come from Embraer. And Boeing's financial position is now a far cry from what it was back in 2019 when this was last discussed. But this is where Boeing's new CEO comes in. As I explained in my previous Boeing video, one of Kelly Ortberg's career strengths is a great experience in negotiating mergers and acquisitions. And that experience should come very handy when Ortberg now goes out looking for funding, both to get the company back on its feet and for the new future plans, which has to involve a new aircraft. As I said in the start, Boeing's CEO needs to be a good storyteller, someone who can get everyone to listen and who can create a beacon of hope, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for those who need Boeing to succeed. And all the reasons why Boeing and Embraer started talking in the first place are basically still valid, so this is a good story to tell. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be simple, and Airbus will of course not just sit back and watch, but if Boeing can regain the airline industry's confidence, there will always be a market for safe, reliable and efficient Boeing jets. And by doing this, they could in one big swoop possibly turn the tide and push Airbus onto the defensive. What do you think? Am I right in seeing this as a potential plan? Let me know in the comments below, and when you're down there, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Now, if you want to see these videos and the Mentor Pilot videos ahead of everyone else, and also help me to create them, consider joining my fantastic Patreon crew by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.